In 1975, the communists decided to launch an offensive, hoping that they could end the war and defeat the South Vietnamese government.
My family lived in a small town called Ban Ma Thuột in the Central Highlands of Vietnam, which had the distinction in March 1975 of being the first town overrun by a communist invasion. My brother was 10, I was 4, and my mother had to make a life and death decision, and the path that she chose was to flee that town with my brother and me, and we walked, I think, 184 kilometers downhill to the nearest port city, which was Nha Trang. We were lucky to actually get on a boat to get to Saigon, where we found our father.
You have to remember, this was an enormous human tragedy. A couple of million Vietnamese were fleeing from the communist forces, evacuating families of soldiers under terrible, terrible conditions.
And a month later, the communists arrived in Saigon as well. And we were lucky again to catch another boat out of Saigon and make it to Guam.
The communists thought it would take them into 1976 to take over the country. But in 1975, like a few weeks later, they were outside Saigon. And they were setting up the barrage. They were going to shell it and then take it over.
I was the man during the last day of South Vietnam to go to Washington to plead for an emergency aid of $700 million. But the Congress refused.
President Ford went on television. He presented to Congress another supplemental request for $722 million. This was in the middle of April. No one could possibly have believed that any of that aid was really ever going to get to South Vietnam in time. By then, the end was inevitable. And even the defenders of it, most of them didn't say, we're going to save South Vietnam. Most of them said, this is to save America's reputation.
I used to say it was not a good page in the history of the American by then. They refused to give South Vietnam a few $100 million, while in the same time the Soviet Union and China, they added the North Vietnamese with their tanks and with the whole equipment to invade South Vietnam by then.
I just felt this immense sense of impending tragedy. I knew that if the North Vietnamese took over, the results were going to be horrendous.
When the Americans started playing that song, White Christmas, then they knew that that was a signal for the Americans to get to their evacuation points, and the country was about to fall.
One night, an American who spoke fluent Vietnamese called my brother and said, you can leave the country, but you only have until tomorrow afternoon at 1 p.m. to get out. Bus picked them up and took them to the airport. That was April 29th, the day before the communists came in. Rockets were beginning to fall. The communists were starting to shell. So they thought they were going to die there. And then suddenly, early in the morning of April 30th, they looked up and they saw these big choppers coming in and landing.
All of us had sort of felt like this war was going to go on forever. You know, that neither side was strong enough to win or weak enough to lose.
When the French were defeated, at least there was this climactic battle at Dien Bien Phu, you know. But Saigon just fell, just like a ripe fruit, you know, it just fell.
I was in a really, really deep depression for weeks following that, because it just made everything I'd done just suspect, you know. What was this all for if we're just going to walk away?
A number of my friends died either in prison or in concentration camps. Some of them escaped by boats in kind of hegiras that you could only imagine.
I didn't care who won. I didn't care who lost. I only cared that the war ended and that Vietnam now experienced peace, and that the country is once again united.
We are not very happy with the American, attitude about how they disengaged from South Vietnam, you see. I have to add it, and it is a very important too, that it was in many ways compensated by the welcome that the American people welcomed the Vietnamese refugees who came to this country. they thank the American people for this welcome, because they leave us free men right now here in the U.S. They have their families, they have their children. The children go to school, to college, and it is quite a successful community of Vietnamese right now in the U.S. And we thank the American people for that.